So this is Accreditation Review, a refresher course teaching to the content standards essential questions 1 and 2. I'm Stephanie Hansen. I am brand new to this position of the Director of the Office of Standards, Leadership, and Learning. I am in my 4th month now, and I'm learning quickly about accreditation. So, and there's my email and my phone number. You feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or are stuck. If you need to talk through something with me, I'm more than willing to help you. I have a staff of 6 people, and our department is in charge of the online learning and the teaching to the content standards portions of the accreditation review. So today we're going to hit the South Dakota State content standards just briefly. We are going to talk about the essential questions that deal with curriculum in your schools. We're going to talk about the requirements for accreditation when it comes to that curriculum. I am going to give you some helpful hints that I have learned just doing some 2019-20 post reviews of schools. Because of COVID-19, of course, there were some delays, and so I am helping to clean up those delayed accreditations. So just some things that I have learned to help schools be better prepared in submitting their evidence. And then I'll have time for questions at the end. So what are the content standards? Basically, the South Dakota content standards express the expectations for learning. They really don't tell you as a district or tell teachers specifically what to teach or how to teach, but they do express the expectations for the depth of the knowledge and the content that students must demonstrate when we talk about mastery. Here are the expectations for student mastery. They articulate what we call rigor, richness, and levels of expectation. By rigor, what we usually think of when we think of rigor and what the accreditation team has defined rigor as is the ability to use critical thinking and problem-solving skills. So the more rigorous the expectations, the more that students have to think and problem solve. Sometimes that means creation too. Richness, this is kind of an ambiguous term, but by richness, we mean the depth of the knowledge that's going on. You might be familiar with Webb's levels, Bloom's taxonomy, so the richness. Most of our content standards are at the upper levels, especially, are written at the higher end of those pyramids, or at the 3 and 4 levels where students are actually synthesizing and analyzing and creating. Can also deal with complexity, where instead of just rote memorization, there's that complexness, the complexity of thinking and articulating and writing. And then the multiple possibilities of interpretation, that students are interpreting different ways that materials can be looked at, different perspectives. So that's what we mean by richness, that things can be appreciated and approached in different ways. And then the levels of expectation are what we expect students to be able to do. And again, I'm referring to Bloom's taxonomy, where they can be explaining, discussing, analyzing, evaluating, even creating content, creating to show what they've learned. And the content standards are there to describe student mastery. What they don't do is they're not a prescribed curriculum. That is up to districts. So basically, curriculum is developed by the districts and the schools and the teachers using a variety of curricular sources. But basically, they align those curricular pieces to the standards, and they meet the requirements of the standards. That's where that freedom to teach comes into play, which is why the state does not prescribe, this is the template you must fill out for this, and this is what you must do, because schools are given that freedom to tailor their curriculum to meet their community needs and their school needs, their district needs. The content standards are there to guide what we expect students to know, and then the schools can develop their own curriculums. Purchased curriculums, Edgenuity, Apex, there are hundreds out there. Textbook series, online curriculum programming, those are not usually completely aligned with South Dakota standards. So if schools choose to use those curricular sources, it is then up to the districts and the schools and the teachers to make sure that those curriculum are aligned to the content standards, which means that there may need to be some editing, some revising, and some supplementation that's happening to those purchased curriculums. There are very few, for example, math books that are aligned to the depth and intention of our South Dakota standards. That is up to the teacher then to bring in more content to ensure that the students are mastering the standards to the depth and the intention that the state expects. So that's where that freedom comes in for school districts, is that they are allowed to create the curriculum and to align that to our South Dakota content standards. So the standards set this expectation, and then the schools create the curriculum to meet those expectations. So how should we use those content standards? And I'll let you read that quickly. And this is taken from a book called The 5 Levers to Improve Learning, and I have the resource at the end of this presentation. Basically, textbooks can be aligned to the potential for addressing a standard, which means that some districts can create their own math textbooks from Pearson or from another publishing company, and they are aligned to the potential for the standard. They may contain the topics and the content that the standards require, but the taught curriculum, that curriculum that is actually taught by teachers that are expected, that the students are expected to learn, those taught curriculum activities need to be explicitly designed to achieve a standard to its depth and intention. And sometimes that takes units and multiple lessons to achieve. For example, most high school textbooks or high school government textbooks present information about the preamble to the US Constitution. But just learning about the circumstances around its creation, the contents of the preamble, and the suggested intent of the preamble does not meet the depth and intent of the 9 through 12 South Dakota content standards that relate to the preamble of the Constitution. And here's that standard. This is standard 9 through 12 under the civics domain, and it's standard 2.4. And there is the standard. Explain how the goals set forth in the preamble of the Constitution reflect enduring issues of American society. So that you can see that students just learning about the preamble to the Constitution does not meet this, this standard. So a district and a school and teachers must create the instructional activities and assessments to ensure that the students master this standard, which means that they must explain how, So in the assessment, students must be able to explain how the goals set forth in the preamble, the goals which they've learned in class and talked about, reflect the enduring issues of American society. Now there's the freedom. Teachers can teach about pretty much any enduring issue in American society. You know, the American dream, the idea that everyone's free, whatever. So the standard sets the depth, which is explain, and the intention, which is how the goals set forth reflect enduring issues of American society. So choosing any government textbook is fine because they'll talk about the US Constitution, but very rarely do you find a textbook or curriculum that will meet the depth of and intention of the South Dakota civics content standards. So that's kind of the difference between the content standards and how we use those content standards and how schools can get their curricula to align to the content standards. All right, the essential questions. Again, the essential questions document can be found on the South Dakota Department of Ed website. and it is under accreditation. And we are number 21 on the whole list of accreditation materials that schools must submit. And it's a download. And it is basically the list of what we require when it comes to looking at the essential questions. And it describes the essential questions, and it gives you some examples, and it provides a question and answer section. I'm not going to link to it. You guys can go in and download it. I would encourage you to download and print it so that you have it as kind of a checklist as you go through essential questions on narratives and finding evidence to support those narratives. And one thing it is very important now that we've concluded the talk about content standards is to please make sure that you're using the current content standards. And those are again found on the DOE website under content standards. There have been updates to the English and language in 2018. So if it's been a while since you revisited the content standards or your accreditation, it again, make sure that your teachers are aligning to the most current versions of the content standards. We do have schools who still turn in lesson plans and things that are aligned to Common Core. So please make sure that you're in your current version of the content standards. And if you can hear of a train, I apologize. I live right next to train tracks. So that is where you can find the teaching to the state content standards, the essential questions, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Whoops, go back. So the biggest hint that I can give schools as they progress through their accreditation process is that they need to start with the narratives for both essential question 1 and essential question 2. So you're going to be writing 2 separate narratives that describe the process, because this is about a process that the accreditation review team really wants to see in schools, that they have this ongoing process that is in place to help your teachers teach to the content standards. Again, the narrative describes that process. Essential question 1 is about the processes that the district uses to ensure that all the South Dakota content standards are included in the taught curriculum for all students. K-12, special needs or not, it just depends. You need to be creating a narrative that describes how you as a district ensure that all the content standards are taught to all students. And in that narrative, as you're describing your process, and schools can describe a variety of processes. Some schools have a standing process already developed that every year something happens in curriculum work for every department, and it's just ongoing, and they describe that process. Some schools describe a process of professional development, professional learning communities. Some schools bring in a consultant who then helps them develop that process, and that's what you describe. Some schools devote 5 days before school to work on nothing but curriculum and to do the vertical alignment and to create scope and sequences, to create curriculum mapping. All of those are evidence that you have created a process. And so in your narrative, you would describe that process, and then you would support that process with the evidence that you would upload, physical file evidence. PDF files are the greatest, and the fewer the files, the better. So if you could combine files, that would be wonderful in situations where you may have multiple pieces of evidence. One thing that really can be beneficial is layering. What I mean by layering is where you describe a small piece of the process and you give us evidence. Then you describe the next piece and you layer on another piece of evidence. So maybe you've had your English department do up a K-12 curriculum map that maps when each standard is taught, and then the map also talks about timelines. And then the next piece of evidence is a scope and sequence for each grade that determines which content standards are discussed during which units, during which time frame, and then maybe you brought in a consultant and did work in a specific type of curriculum. Maybe you're using some sort of English language support curriculum or a textbook series in which you brought in someone to talk to your English language teachers about how to address content standards, South Dakota content standards, by bringing in supportive pieces. And that's another piece of evidence. You're layering all of the evidence to support the idea that your school has a process that makes sure that all the content standards are addressed. So in your narrative, you'll describe what was submitted. So you'll say, this process can be evidenced by this piece of documentation, curriculum maps, for example. You'll say why you submitted that. The curriculum map shows this. And then you talk about how that aligns or shows or describes the process. So that's the nuances of layering documentation to ensure that you clearly describe that process. One of the frustrating things is to receive the documentation from schools after their deadline and then have no narrative to create the story of their process. And it becomes then our job, which we really can't do, to go through and open up documents and try to figure it out. We want that to be very explicitly explained in your narrative so that when we open a piece of information or a piece of evidence, we know exactly what it is and why it's there. It makes our accreditation process run a bit more smoothly, and it also clearly indicates that this school district has a process that they use to ensure that all the standards are taught at every grade level and in all content areas. Narrative or essential question number 2 is again about a process, but in this case, you're describing the steps and the processes that you have in place to ensure that what teachers are teaching in the classrooms addresses the depth and intention of the standard. And then again, you support that with evidence. So we want to see stories. Is the documentation, the narrative and the evidence, a story of what actually happens in your taught curriculum? And is it a story of what happens for all your students? The process should talk about the district's requirements for teachers. Do you have common lesson plan templates? Do you require teachers to have specific things in their lesson plans? Do you have unit plan templates that you require all teachers to use that have specific requirements that show that teachers are teaching to the depth and intent of the standard? For example, things like, what does it look like in your classroom? I always think of when I was in college learning to be a teacher, when I had to write lesson plans, and they always told me, write your lesson plans so that a sub could come in and teach your class. That's what we're looking for. If the instructional methods are discussion of the questions relating to a read text, and then they're going to get into groups and they're going to talk about these essential questions, that's what we need to see in unit and lesson plans, because that helps us get the picture of how teachers are teaching to the depth and intention of a standard. Let's see, the process then should talk about how the standards are implemented. So if a standard dictates that students must analyze, then the lesson plans should show evidence that students are doing the analysis. And then how the students are demonstrating or showing that they have met the intended standards. How are they being assessed? Just stating that the assessments will be formative by class observation isn't enough. What are you observing? We need to have that explained in a lesson or a unit plan so that we can see the whole picture. If there's an assessment, a summative assessment or a formal assessment, attach that assessment to the lesson plan so that we can see how the students were demonstrating knowledge. If the end result was to be a paper, submit a student one, redacted, so we don't have names, but submit the end result so that we can see that picture of how students are being assessed to make sure that they're covering or mastering the depth and intention. And then you could also include information about how teachers reflect on taught lessons. Are teachers required to write up weekly reflections about how the week went, what worked and what didn't work, how they knew that students had learned content and materials? So they should be reflecting on their practice and on student learning. The narrative should describe or show how teachers are intentionally teaching to the content standards and how students are learning those standards. A hint here, teachers need to be intentional about which standards they're covering in each lesson or unit. Just because, for example, my lesson deals with several incidences of battles fought in World War I, and they talk about other things that deal with World War I, doesn't mean that I include 15 content standards that have the mention of war in them or conflict. Teachers need to be very intentional. It's not feasible for a teacher to cover 15 content standards in one lesson. So remind teachers that covering a single content standard in a lesson or 5 or 6 in a unit is more intentional because they can focus on the depth and the intent of the standards that they are intentionally picking. For example, an English unit on writing to inform would cover several writing and ELA content standards that may take 6 weeks to cover. Maybe they're going to be writing a research paper and then writing up individual lesson plans that build up to that final evaluation that would show the depth and intent that the students learned the content standard to. So that's the narrative about the process. Another thing to think about in your process is, how does that taught curriculum become the learned curriculum? How do you ensure that students have learned the content? And then what happens then for follow through? What if someone or something isn't covered? How do you ensure that that doesn't happen again? Or how do you ensure that teachers understand the depth and intent and that they are covering the standards that as deeply as they should be? So that's all part of that process. One thing that there's a lot of confusion about, and I was, when I first started this job, a bit confused about depth and intention too. So I have focused on this science standard. For the depth, I have highlighted the depth words in bold and then underlined the intention words. So this content standard is high school science, life science, standard 2-6. And the standard is that they must evaluate claims, evidence, and reasoning. That's the depth. It's telling you how deep they have to go. They have to evaluate, which is at the higher end of Bloom's and at the higher end of Webb's. And they have to evaluate specifically claims, evidence, and reasoning. So they're evaluating sources. The intention then is the content. So in this case, they're looking at ecosystems. So they're looking at research or sources that make claims about the interactions in ecosystems under stable conditions. And then they're looking at claims that extreme fluctuations can cause new ecosystems to be developed. So then they're evaluating, meaning they're judging the effectiveness, non-effectiveness, the value, the truthfulness of that claim. So by the end, for the evaluation or the assessment, students should then be evaluated to that depth. So maybe they're writing a paper, maybe they're creating a poster, maybe they're doing an infographic that will demonstrate that they can evaluate claims, evidence, and reasoning that are dealing with ecosystems and the interactions that happen within them under stable conditions and under fluctuating situations. So that's what we mean by depth, which is the bold and the intention. Now this really cannot be taught in one lesson. this may be taught in a unit on ecosystems. And it's one of the many standards that deal with ecosystems at the high school level that will be taught in this unit. And over time, students will be learning things like how to evaluate a source, dealing with things like authority and credibility, accuracy, bias, objectivity, timeliness, those kinds of issues, intended audience. So there may be several lessons that eventually result in students mastering this standard, which is why I stress the development of unit plans. Unit plans can make very clear the processes that teachers are using to ensure that students are mastering content standards to the depth and intention required.
Stephanie?
Yes.
My teachers can get confused on how many standards they should put in, you know, when they take a look, when they're doing their planning, they go, well, I cover a little reading, I might cover, so they get a little overwhelmed with that process. What's a good way for me to give them directions on how to do what you're describing, how to narrow that down?
Right.
Can you kind of maybe speak to that again? Because
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes. Probably the best way is to create that scope and sequence for teachers, or have them create the scope and sequence so that they can see where they're covering which standards. It's basically a weekly, here's the context that I'm going to cover, here's the content, and here are the standards I'm going to address. And teachers really have to remember that they can only address so many standards at one time, because there's this thing I call cognitive overload, where students get overwhelmed with so much new information that they just shut down. And so that's why I say teachers need to be very deliberate about which content standards they're truly teaching to students in that lesson. So it may be that teachers need to go back and make sure, one, that they're covering the content standards several times throughout the academic year, whether they're just introducing the standard, whether they're teaching it to mastery, whether they're reviewing the standard. I think of kindergarten and teaching to read. They don't just cover A on one day and then move on to B. They cover A, and then they cover A later on, and then they cover A later on again, in order to help kids re-experience that knowledge several times for it to get into long-term memory. So that's what I counsel instructors and say, make sure, one, that you're covering all the content standards and that you have some sort of graphic representation of that, and that, two, you're making sure that you cover them several times throughout the academic year. That way there's a lot less stress. I know that especially elementary teachers are very stressed about there are so many content standards to cover. If you have that plan and you know that you're hitting them several times, it takes a little bit of the pressure off, because now you can spread them out over time, rather than today I'm going to cover kindergarten's writing standards, 15 writing standards and 13 reading standards or whatever. Focus on just the few that you can help students master, and then review them time and again throughout the academic year. Does that help? It does take some planning, but it does help. I've seen lesson plans where history teachers have a lesson plan where they talk about World War II with 20 content standards listed below. And you know on that day they're not mastering 20 content standards. But they have to make sure that they're covering the content standards, but not to the depth and the intent. So I would say pick the 4 that you're going to cover to mastery today. Pick the 3 in writing that you're going to cover to mastery in this lesson. But if you have an overall plan that that you're covering them multiple times, then that stress is lessened. And teachers don't have to freak out about trying to cover so many content standards in one lesson or in a week. Is that a little bit helpful?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
they just get
You're
a little
very-
bit, they get frightened.
Yes, I taught English language arts for 21 years. I totally get it, where you have that pressure to cover all those standards. But in our English department, we spread them out, and we made sure that we were covering them several times and that we had that vertical alignment. So that skills that they mastered in 7th grade ELA, we practiced again in 8th grade and 9th grade, so that by the time they got to 10th grade, they had it down and we didn't have to teach it anymore. They just knew it. So the same can be done in middle school and elementary. All right, sorry, the rubric. There is a rubric. It is in the same spot that the essential questions explanations are. It is linked right here where it says rubric, and this is the rubric that we as reviewers use when we look at your narratives and your documentation for the essential questions. I'm not going to click on this because it's going to take me out and I'm going to have to figure out and re-show, but you can certainly go to the accreditation page of the DOE and find these pretty clearly under the list of things that have to happen during accreditation. But the rubric is something I would print. I would give it to teachers, to whoever's in charge of writing the narratives and collecting the evidence, because this is a cool checklist to use to keep you on track so that you're not overwhelmed. Again, when you're writing the narratives for essential questions 1 and 2, the more explicit your narrative and the better descriptions you have of the attached evidence, the easier it is for us to see your processes. And we have fewer questions. A lot of times teacher or schools are contacted by our accreditation team and with questions that say, we're not getting why this was included, or the narrative doesn't provide any explanations for the evidence that you submitted, and then you end up doing it all over again. We want to avoid that. We would love to just open up all of your evidence and say, wow, the narrative is great, the evidence is descriptive, it's telling us the processes in both situations, they've nailed it, and then not have to revisit this over and over and over. So the rubric is a great resource. I encourage you to take a look at it and use it. It has questions and answers at the bottom. It has some helpful hints. If you have questions about it, feel free to contact me. All right, any questions before I move on to the next slide? We're almost to the end. All right, some helpful information. These are the things that I have found very useful in learning how to review documentation and narratives that schools submit. We've been practicing and practicing because we have I'm new and I have to do this for the first time in October. And so I have been training a lot on how to do this. The most helpful information I can give you is, one, to be sure that your school is using the current standards. That is primarily the one I've seen most often is that schools are submitting wonderful lesson plans and unit plans, and they have these great processes, but they're all done for the wrong standards. They're not up to date, or they're the Common Core, or they're pulling the standards from their textbooks, which aren't the South Dakota State standards. So just make sure that you reiterate to your curriculum directors and to your staff and teachers that they need to be the most current standards, which are found on the standards page on the DOE website. Start with the narrative. Get it down, whether it's an outline form, whatever. Sit down and get the narrative down so that you know what kind of evidence that you need to pull. Most schools start with evidence and try to craft a narrative around it, and that's just not very useful because then the process has holes in it and it doesn't create the story. So write the narratives first and then find the evidence to prove what you say you're doing. And it needs to be supported with intentional selections, not just throw 200 pieces of evidence at their accreditors and hope they figure it out. Please don't do that. Describe your processes in detail and supply those layers of evidence. So supply those lesson and unit plans, supply those curriculum maps and scope and sequences, Supply the agenda of what teachers learn at your training with a consultant. Supply those reflective pieces that teachers are writing about what's working and what's not working about a current curriculum. Those kinds of pieces of evidence show a process, and we need to see those. Be sure your lesson plans are complete for evidence. So again, if your assessment is that students are going to do problems 1 through 30, the odds in the textbook, you'll need to copy those pages and supply them with the lesson plan, because that, without actually physically seeing what students are doing, our reviewers can't tell if students are mastering the standard being taught to the depth and the intention of the standard. So encourage teachers to include PDF copies or copies of worksheets, handouts, workbook pages, textbook pages. Those are all parts of unit plans and lesson plans that we really need to see in order to ensure that they're mastering to the depth and the intent. Unit and lesson plans need to clearly show how the students are mastering the content. So don't just say that assessments are, the students are going to take a test. We need to see test questions that are directly aligned to that standard, that show that students mastered that standard that's in the lesson plan. Those kinds of things. Again, I'm going to reiterate, teachers need to intentionally select those content standards that they are teaching in that unit or that lesson, because just throwing them all in there is not productive, because again, there's no way that teachers can teach 20 content standards in a 50-minute lesson plan and have students show mastery to the depth and the intent. Your evidence and process should create that picture of mastery. Next generation science standards are kind of closely aligned to South Dakota, but they do need to be using South Dakota standards. I believe when the South Dakota science standards were written, they were, we did pull heavily from the next generations, but again, when you're putting them in your lesson plans, they need to be the state content standards. So I would have your science teachers pull the science standards and start correlating to see which ones match up with their next generations, because there are differences. Some of the next generations are not in our content standards, and some of our content standards are not in next generation. And South Dakota content standards may have changed the depth and intention. So Mary Helen, please have your science teachers do some correlation between what they currently have and how they match up with the current South Dakota state standards. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
They
struggled with that back and forth, and thanks.
Yes, you're welcome, because that's one we'll send them back and say, sorry, these are not the South Dakota ones. You'll have to, resubmit. And we don't want that to happen. We want you to submit once, have a perfect picture created, and then you'll be done with that. And that's one more year of accreditation you'll have taken care of.
So Stephanie, last year, that's probably what they did. If we do that going forward for this year, is that going to be fine? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Use the rubric that's on the website. It is a very important piece of information for your schools to use to guide you as you create your documents for submission for these contents or for these two pieces of the accreditation. Use the website. Again, content standards are there. There are videos in the accreditation section that go into a lot of detail about the essential questions, 1 and 2. Kelly Royer and Matt Gill created a great video, an 8-minute video that I submitted, gave you as homework. Watch those videos. Steph Higdon did an 18-minute explanation with a lot more examples about how to address depth and intention of the content standards for essential question 2. Those videos are on the accreditation page under resources. You watch them, show them to your teachers. They provide very important information about teaching to the depth and intent and creating this process, this narrative of the process. Let's see. Here are my references. There's the 5 Levers to Improve Learning by Frontier and Rickabaugh. It is a wonderful book to do a school-wide improvement plan. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me through the Department of Ed. Give me a call. Email is probably the best way to get a hold of me, but I will try to assist you in any way that I can. And if I can't, I'll try to find someone who can. So I thank you for attending, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your week, and have a wonderful holiday weekend.